Red Dawn. Part 1. Republic Cruiser Chimera. First Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. "Look that station go," exclaimed one of the sensor operators. "Easy, kid. Remember where you are," Palpatine chided his subordinate. "Sorry, sir. It won't happen again." "Better not. Though off the record, I agree with the notion." Chuckles answered the Commodore's quip. The heavy missiles did better than the initial projections called for. Lieutenant Tolan added. "That's the second time the boffins knew what they were talking about," Yularen chuckled. "It makes me apprehensive. What's the status of our magazines?" "Down to 10% on the siege missiles." "Flush the rest of the birds. The fleet will advance. Capital ships are to concentrate fire on the remaining enemy mobile forces. Once those are dealt with, take out the Golans. Our escorts are to eliminate the defense platforms. When the battle line is engaged, bomber wings are free to strike targets of opportunity." "Aye, sir." Relaying orders. =RK=. Couple of hours submerged into the Force, using the light side to recover from the strain caused by the battle meditation. An energy bar and a lot of the local equivalent of aspirin did wonders for my disposition. Oh, I wasn't up for fun and games, like joining the first wave of the ground invasion, that was reserved for my apprentice and the Jedi, but at least I was more or less functional. Which meant that I had a job to do. So, while I munched on another energy bar, there was a data pad in my other hand and I was busy browsing the compiled list of fleet losses. They were rather severe, though nothing like the butcher's bill that this battle should have yielded. At least on paper both sides were evenly matched. The most optimistic estimates called for about 50 per recent fleet casualties, if we won. Thanks to my battle meditation and the plan Valentra, the Oni director and me cobbled together, we got out of the scrap relatively light. If you can call a third of the fleet lost low casualties. That had been unpleasant for more than the obvious reasons. I felt every single death during the battle, thanks to the battle meditation connecting me with my men and the few organics in the Cis fleet. They fed the dark side, and while actually making me a bit stronger in the Force, strained my control. It was making it harder to deal with the persistent seduction of the whispers in the back of my head. Oh, it would be so good to just let my control go and revel in all the dark side had to offer. All the power, the immortality it promised. No longer having to pay lip service to Palpatine and the Republic. To build my own empire. I shook my head. Even if I knew that it was all a lie, or at best a short-lived gain before I was left totally insane, her whispers and suggestions had a dark allure that I found hard to resist. All I could do with the unrestrained power of the dark side on my disposal. I just had to stop fighting it at every turn. I shuddered as a familiar chill went up my spine. The dark side was coiling around me, anticipating the next round of slaughter. I focused my mind, doing my best to ignore the whispers. =RK=. Light Cruiser Corellian Fury. Task Force Lacoon Flagship. First Assault Fleet. High orbit over Geonosis. After the immediate aftermath of the fleet-on-fleet engagement was dealt with, Jolie became a spectator. His cruiser squadron had fallen back, behind the main body of Republic ships in order to escort the remaining carriers. That in turn left him free to watch the fireworks, something that warmed his old, smuggler's heart. It had all started innocent enough. The fleet had reformed just out of the planetary defense grid's effective weapon range. The ships had pumped their ECM levels as much as possible, followed by ripple-firing shoals of missiles. Part of the ordnance sent downrange were anti-fighter darts as well as electronic warfare birds, meant to sweep away what was left of the enemy fighters and target weapon emplacements. On their heels were waves of Lancer siege missiles. Those new weapons were big, a bit longer than two bombers strapped together and with similar dimensions. The concept of the weapons was all but new. It has been known for a very long time, though believed inefficient in the age of shields. Further, it was meant for long-range engagements, something that would be only useful if the enemy could be pinned defending a stationary target. Like Geonosis, for example. Even then, it was an expensive weapon that was really useful in a handful of tactical scenarios. Conventional wisdom said that just using turbo laser was much better. Much less fuss and less strain on your logistics train. Not to mention that in order to defeat shields, those missiles needed to come relatively close before detonating and thus activating their laser heads, which made them vulnerable for intercept from fighters and point defense. However, in this case, those weaknesses were anything but. The standard doctrine was to send your fighters forward to deal with missiles of this kind, which the Seps refused to do, in order to preserve the vultures they had left. That course of action had predicatable results. No one was particularly surprised when the darts failed to cause any noticeable damage on the battle stations, merely diabling a few of their weapons. Yet they did their jobs, screening their much larger sisters. Only 10% of the first Lancer wave was picked off, before they reached standoff range and detonated, all of them missing the Golan stations they were flying at. Solo grinned viciously. Shields flared briefly, fighting to absorb and deflect lances of pure energy. Then the defensive fields failed and 10 more munificents died, their hulls shattered by invisible beams of pure energy. That awoke whoever was in charge, and the vultures surged on, dashing straight at the next wave of missiles, which only looked like lancers. The large missiles blew up few seconds before the enemy fighters fell upon them, releasing a swarm of darts down their throats. The vulture flight stood no chance and slammed straight into the trap. The explosions caught on camera by the recon birds in the vanguard of the fleet were beautiful to behold. Then the second Lancer wave struck true. This time they did target the battle stations. 2 of them to be precise. The missiles didn't even attempt to kill them outright. Instead they were instructed to take out the shield generator and heavy weapons. Few hundred missiles concentrated their fire on a small section of the deflector fields, temporarily overwhelming and piercing the defenses. A lot of the incoming energy was either absorbed or dispersed. A big fraction of what went through wasted itself ablating armor, yet enough remained to damage the generator on one Golan and outright destroy that of the second. When the next missile salvo struck, those 2 stations were left as drifting, toothless hulks. RK equals DCS Nemesis. Low orbit over Geonosis. Admiral Ningo glared balefully at Grievous. The damn cyborg had survived after all and even managed to get to his ship, just in time to order the suicide charge of most vultures that had survived the previous engagements. Yet, he held his tongue. The solution didn't feel like dying by the hand of the madman who was in his nominal command. It had been obvious that the missiles were some kind of bait, sending all but the first wave without a covering force of a barrage of anti-fighter ordnance. He shook his head and turned his sight towards the tactical plot. It appeared that the enemy had finally exhausted their supply of heavy missiles. The Republic fleet was picking up speed, advancing towards their position. While before the Relentless barrages, Ningo had been reasonably sure that he could further bloody the enemy, now even that was going to be denied to him. Only 7 battle stations were still largely intact, backed up by what was left from his mobile forces and about 700 or so defensive platforms. But the latter were more or less evenly spread over the planet, unable to concentrate their firepower for the final round of the space battle. Even words, now there was insufficient number of fighters left to blunt the impending attacks from Republic bombers, which were massing up together with their own escorts. Maneuver our remaining units behind the Golans. We'll use them as a shield until the enemy is in effective range, Ningo suggested. That way, their mobile forces, which were much less defended in comparison, would survive longer and would have a chance to take out enemy ships weakened by the battle stations. Multiple new contacts detected, exclaimed one of the B-1s which was monitoring the sensors. So their ground units arrived, muttered the Admiral. And thanks to your incompetence, we no longer have the forces to intercept them. Grievous seethed. The Admiral rolled his eyes behind his back and called the sensor data. As if those acclimators and their escorts were a potent force in their own right, more than enough to deal with whatever would have left from the Cis fleet even if they had won and destroyed the Republic fleet. Now all he could do was ensure that as many of the enemy ships were taken out before his remaining units were gone. If Grievous let him fight his fleet. RK equals Republic cruiser negotiated 2. Battle Group Titan flagship. 5 light seconds from Geonosis. The commanders of the ground forces had gathered for a final briefing before they joined their units for the drop. Shark T looked around, evaluating the men and women in the room. Needless to say, most of them wore the same face. With few exceptions, those had the rank of commander or general. The rest were either the Jedi or the officers in charge of the new units, which weren't made up by clones. It remained to be seen how they were going to mesh with the GAR forces once on the ground. While she had heard of only a few problems, that didn't mean much at this stage. I can confirm the good news. The fleet won a major battle over Geonosis and is in the process of dismantling the orbital defense network. By the time we are in position, we will have orbital superiority. She had to pause for a few seconds while almost everyone cheered. She allowed herself a small smile and continued. Now, thanks to the extensive network of anti-orbital weaponry that the locals had built, we won't be in position to simply orbital strikes all over the place and just mop up. Good to know. What about air support? General Willem Maxtro, the commander of the Anxian Rangers, asked. We'll be getting plenty. From what Admiral Yularan told me, I believe that 1st Assault's bomber force is largely intact. Then there are our own fighter and bombers too. The main opposition in the air is expected to be from Geonosian air breathers, because the vultures in system are a spent force. So we are going with Red 3 then? Colonel Gyro Pell, the CEO of the Pharmacy Laners, asked. Yes. Our heavy divisions will land at the designated areas with heavy orbital support, while the airmobile units will drop in, bypassing the nearest defensive lines and striking at various strategic targets. Those include local CNC centers, power stations and of course the theater shield generators. What about the planetary shield? One of the clone commanders asked. We have contingency in place to deal with them. I'll be leading units from 1st Shock Army against the main generator complex. We will be going in to support General Vale's Helldiver Regiment. That will be the first of our strategic objectives. We will have to either hold the place while reinforcements arrive or trash it and exfiltrate. Now for the different unit assessments. There won't be any major alternations on Red 3 at this point. That announcement got a few relieved chuckles. 7th Army will be landing here, 200 clicks from the shield generator complex. They will be shielded by the artillery positions emplaced around it by this mountain chain, though either coursing or going around it will slow them down. She nodded at Obi-Wan. I'll be spearhead the push towards the experimental droid factories. As you all know, that is our primary objective on Geonosis. Unfortunately, the place is protected by extensive network of overlapping theater shields, so we will have to crack it the hard way. General Mindy's troops and the Rangers will assist in the initial push. The Pharmacy Lancers will, as well as the Ryloth 1st Ranger Regiment, will make a push towards this valley. Kenobi zoomed the image of Geonosis floating in the center of the table domination, the meeting room. This is the place where the locals rebuilt most of their war-related industry after our last visit. You will be cleaning the way from any light enemy forces and provide support for 9th Army's heavy armor, which will be making a landing on these coordinates. He pointed a large plane, 200 clicks from the Pharmacy projected drop point. Once their leading divisions are deployed, they will be heading your way. Red Dawn =RK Part 2. 71st Bomber Squadron. Low orbit over Geonosis. Falk drove his bomber into a roll, barely avoiding a burst of flak fire. His craft shook from the blast wave, but he compensated and dived at the battle station below. His squadron followed, deftly avoiding the last-ditch effort of their target to fend them off. Around them, space was lit up with explosions as the fleet was duking it out with what was left of the Cis ships and the remnant of the orbital defenses. Falk saw a munificent frigate being blown apart by turbo laser bolts bigger than his fighter, then he spun again and his cockpit view was obscured by the 71st's target. He waited for a moment, before unleashing his bomber's load of proton torpedoes in quick succession. The armor plating protecting turbo laser turrets and concussion missile launchers shattered in a handful of hits, the following impacts disabling or outright destroying the weapon emplacements. By the time his squadron finished their run, a quarter of the Golan's offensive firepower was gone. Falk glanced at his readouts. 2 of the newbies didn't make it. He shrugged, privately glad that he hadn't gotten to know them all that well, before banking right. Good job, lads. Follow me in. We are making another run, then we are off for reloading. As they headed in, a swarm of bombers overflew them, heading for one of the handful Cis battleships that were still operational. He doubted that the battle wagon would be more than a powerless hulk once they were done with it. However, the battle wasn't as one-sided as the lieutenant might have hoped. While he was diving at the battle station, he had a great view of a Venator which went afoul of 2 Golans and was pounded into scrap before most of the station's weapons could be silenced. =RK Republic Cruiser Chimera. 1st Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. Sir, the remaining Confederate ships are making a break for it. Their frigates are screening that DCS. the sensor operator shouted. "Their capital ships won't make it past the planet's gravity well before we pound them into scrap." The admiral frowned. He zoomed in the tactical display. Almost all remaining vultures were converging at that point of the battlefield. "Retask our fighters in the nearby sectors to intercept. They are most likely covering the escape of their commander. Concentrate the Guardian system efforts on that sector too." Soon enough, the plot shifted, whole torrent squadrons swarming the Confed ships which were attempting a breakthrough. "Griff. Sir, look at that." The same lieutenant shouted again, earning himself a dirty look from Palpatine. Yularen zoomed out the display. A few seconds later a look of displeasure appeared on his face. "Hey equals. Talon Squadron. High orbit over Geonosis. This better work." Grievous snarled as he forced his fighters' engines to the point of overload. "If it doesn't, we are dead anyway." Admiral Ningo shrugged in the back of the cockpit of a two-seater Solution starfighter. He had a squadron of those birds on his ship, which were meant as his personal escort. Now they were about to prove their worth. The small craft went on afterburner, straining their engines to their melting point in an attempt to break clear from Geonosis' gravity well. They were screened by 100-odd vultures, which were instructed to fly in a funnel formation, using their bodies as a physical shield against enemy fire. It was a race between the Guardian missiles that would be undoubtedly sent their way and whatever enemy fighters were still in the vicinity after most of them was sent against the bait. They had 15 seconds head start before Ningo's cockpit was bathed into the shrill beep of the lock-on alarm. Targeting sensors were locked on his fighters and missiles were sprinting their way. He glanced out and saw the vultures shifting, moving to better protect their charges. The admiral helplessly waited as long seconds slowly ticked by, when suddenly the cockpit was bathed in bluish light. A vulture blew up, then another and another in quick succession. Ningo glanced at the instruments. They were still 30 seconds from the edge of the gravity well. At this rate, they weren't going to make it. His pilot, the leader of Talon Squadron, apparently agreed with that assessment. "Gentlemen, it was honor serving with you. Now go intercept those damn missiles," he ordered. Half the squadron peeled off and charged the swarm of ordnance heading straight at them. They opened fire with laser cannons and their own missiles, which was merely a drop in the ocean. That is until the lead two Talons opened their cargo compartments, spilling reserve parts behind them. The rest of the Solution fighters charging the missile swarm did so too, a couple of seconds later. It was the last thing that they would ever do. Moments later missiles either found their mark, blowing up fighters which didn't even attempt to evade, but flew straight firing all the way until the bitter end, or plowed in the small artificial debris field, detonating harmlessly. That desperate maneuver was far from enough to take out all the darts, yet it bought precious seconds for the rest of Talon Squadron and their charges. Ningo grit his teeth as the last of the vultures expended itself against a missile flying straight at his ride. Just few more seconds. The admiral winced when his fighter shook viciously, almost throwing him out of his seat despite the restraints. In the same moment the cockpit was bathed in blinding light. =RK=, Republic Cruiser Chimera. First Assault Fleet Flagship. High orbit over Geonosis. The criffing bastards got away. Palpatine, who was leaning over the sensor station, muttered. "Pity. It would have been great if we nailed their commander. Whoever it was did pretty good," Yularen stated. "Yes. They will be trouble in the future," the Commodore added. The Admiral returned his attention to the bigger picture, disgruntled that he had fallen for the feint. He honestly hadn't believed that the enemy would try getting out using small craft once they knew the true capabilities of the Guardian. However, they had masterfully made him focus his attention at attempting bait, buying themselves enough time and distance to get a chance at surviving the inevitable missile strike. He silently cursed the missed opportunity at depriving the enemy of one of their competent admirals and turned his attention at mopping up the orbital defenses. Freedom's battle group had the breakout attempt well in hand, and the rest of the fleet was reducing the remaining two Golans. Those would be dealt with shortly by bomber wings, which were already moving in for the death strike. "Sir, we are mostly done here." Palpatine surmised the situation. "However, the planetary shields are up and running. How are we going to deal with them?" "Apparently it's a need to know." "Yularen." It was. A new voice interjected. "I have an acquaintance down there." He waved at the planet below. "It remains to be seen if we'll be taking the shields the easy or the hard way." The Admiral turned around to see General Vale entering the bridge, looking somewhat better. At least he didn't look like the death warmed twice over. Palian looked incredulous at his commander. "A single being?" he exclaimed. "Yep. He is perfect for the task." =Hey equals. Planetary Shield Generator Command Center. Geonosis. Vikal Plog surveyed his domain from a raised platform in the middle of the room. He was the Geonosian elite in charge of one of the most important installations on his home world, and by the Queens, he was going to make sure it ran perfectly. He stared in turn at the backs of the workers manning the stations controlling the intricate network of generators and shield emitters protecting Geonosis, as if daring them to make a mistake. He would have preferred that his installation was manned exclusively by warrior caste members, but unfortunately that was impractical. Whatever else you could say about the workers, most of it less than flattering, they knew how to fix tech fast. On the other hand, Plog and his exalted kind were best on the battlefield or in charge of important facilities. While he knew that his job was vital, Vikal couldn't suppress the instinct to go out and be amongst the first to meet the Criffing Republic forces. If they managed to actually pass through the shields after their previous visit, the Queens were displeased, issuing orders that their world must be turned into fortress, thus making a repeat performance highly unlikely. While it would have been better if the Geonosians' allies had managed to win in space, Plog actually preferred it this way. The last battle had been over before more than a handful of his kind could engage the enemy, because they were stationed at locations rather far away from the places the Gar attacked. This time it was going to be different. The Geonosian elite warriors were mobilized and ready for battle. They, just like Vikal, were cybernetically enhanced war machines, wielding powerful beam weapons and protected by master-crafted armor. He smiled at the thought and almost reverently petted the heavy weapon which encased his right hand, before returning his attention to the holographic display representing his world's orbitals. The defenses were almost gone and the enemy transports were growing near. He smiled when the nearest comm station hissed to life, announcing that now all ground-based anti-orbital weapons were free to seek targets of opportunity. He was still smiling when moments later, a monomolecular blade found a weak spot in the armor surrounding his neck and severed his spine. =RK=. The command center stood still, the 6 elite warriors who were providing internal security just staring at their leader. First they saw the blade, sticking from the back of his neck. It sparkled, the air around it warping, revealing a dull red metal hand, to which it was attached. "One meatbag down," a mechanical voice muttered. The guards raised their weapons a moment too late. The air twisted further, showing a heavily armed droid, which had sneaked in their midst. Before they could line up shots, the command center was turned into a charnel house when multiple explosions shook it, pelting everything within with half-molten shrapnel. Consoles became pieces of fast-flying death, scything unprotected Geonosians. HK-117 jumped back, thermal detonators flying from his hands. At the same time, 2 stealthy drones became visible near the ceiling, sending crimson lances at a single elite guard. In all the bedlam no one noticed how the locking mechanism of the doors was fused shut. The assassin droid would have smiled if he could. This was what he was made for. Pure, unrestrained havoc. HK-117 danced, faster than most organics could follow, barely evading beams of amber light. The command center shook again, bathed in the light and heat of thermal detonators blowing up. In bare moments, 4 of the 7 elites were taken out, evening the odds. The assassin rolled left, amber beam briefly grazing his shield. That alone drained a third of his deflector, sending warnings through his system. He jumped over a trashed console, a repeating blaster in his hands. Behind the droid, the drones were playing tag with one of the elites, while the last 2 were engaging him. HK-117 hit the ground and rolled, avoiding a sweeping beam. His weapon spoke, shredding blaster bolts at the unprotected feet of the overgrown insect. Its agonized screech was music for the droid's audio receptors. The heavily armored being crashed on the ground, while his buddy tried to bisect the assassin with its weapon. HK evaded by a hairbreadth and threw a thermal detonator, finishing its wounded victim. Then he vaulted forward, using the blast wave as booster for his jump. The nimble machine flew over the other elite Geonosian, avoiding a sweeping beam of deadly energy. HK-117 landed lightly on his feet, moving in a blur. His blaster clattered on the ground just as the droid slammed a pair of vibroblades in the back of the big Geonosian. The local whimpered when the assassin twisted its weapons, before withdrawing them and letting his latest victim fall bonelessly to the ground. HK-117 turned his head to the right and his artificial eyes glared at the single remaining drone. The other one was already turned into molten slag by the last remaining warrior. "I expected more from you, guys." The droid shook his head sadly. "You couldn't handle just a pair of meatbags." He sounded affronted at his synthetic sibling's failure. The Geonosian turned his head towards the sound a moment after disposing of the second drone with a well-aimed shot, only to see the cooling corpse of his comrade and no sight of the infernal machine. "Looking for me?" a hated voice asked from behind. Before the warrior could swing his bulk around, HK jumped on his back, blade slashing down. A few seconds later, the ancient droid made his way to the raised platform where he assassinated the facility's commander. It was the one place that was still somewhat intact. HK plugged himself in the command center's network and started working, while the base's security were attempting to breach the door. He wasn't concerned. It was a really nice door, the finest Geonosian engineering could make. It would hold for a few minutes. More than enough time. By the time the entrance was breached by the base's security, the shields were powered down, leaving the complex vulnerable. It would be 15 minutes before one of the secondary command centers could bypass the lockdown initiated from the command center. Even longer before they could reactivate the shields. It would be far too late. =RK=. Republic assault ship under the breach. Low orbit over Geonosis. Shark T suppressed a shudder when the drop pod sealed around her. A moment later the HUD of her light armor lit up with green light showing that all systems were nominal. Drop in T-30. The commander responsible for the initial part of the deployment shouted in her communicator. "All units, sound off," the Jedi ordered. She was pointedly trying not to think about the madness she was about to take part in. Shark T patched herself through the frequency of her command battalion, listening. "First platoon, accompany as green. Second platoon, accompany as nominal." She took a deep breath, calmed by the professional discharge of her soldiers. Just 10 of the pods showed red lights and she was thankful for the excellent job the engineers did in making the new tech perform up to spec. For now, the real test was about to commence. She switched channels, listening as the battalions started reporting their readiness. 2nd Battalion, Helldiver Regiment is green. Only 7 malfunctioning pods. A clone commander reported. 3rd Battalion, Helldiver Regiment is green. 5 pods down. This crisp voice sent shiver down Shark T's spine. She was still unable to make up her mind about Vale's newest apprentice, Arya Astra, a clone of a Chiss woman, who was also a Sith. Not to mention that she led the first attack on the Jedi Temple in millennia. Yet Vale had not only saved her at the end of the battle, but taken her under his wing. While T knew that what happened wasn't really the woman's fault, not when she had been used as a brainwashed, disposable weapon, she simply couldn't help it. Longtime friends of hers, good people, had died in that attack. The fact that Arya was a Sith didn't help either. It wasn't like she was seeking redemption by trying to turn a new leaf and join the Order. What she felt towards Astra wasn't hate. Not really. It was something she couldn't really place into words. It was more akin to resentment, because of how easy she was given a second chance. Not even a slap on the wrist for her actions, instead she was rewarded by being apprenticed to a powerful Force adept. 10, 9, 8. Shark T's scattered thoughts were interrupted by the pre-launch countdown. She took a deep breath and spoke, "May the Force be with you." 1. A loud thump later and sudden acceleration slammed into the Jedi Master. Red Dawn =RK=. Part 3. 10 kilometers above Planetary Shield Generator Complex. Geonosis. Arya hadn't been more afraid in her short life. Certainly not when she led the attack on the Jedi Temple. That had been exhilarating, the first time she had felt alive. Not even while she lay dying in the Great Hall, broken and defeated. Then she had been relieved more than anything else. She had failed in her mission, no matter that it never had a chance of success, and accepted the price. When her master held her very soul in his hands and saved her, she was both stunned and fascinated at the raw power she felt. As if the Force itself was his to command. Oh, Arya knew that he was one of the most dangerous men she would ever meet, that in anything resembling a stand-up fight she would lose. At least before her training was fully completed, and that was many years away. Yet she didn't fear him. There was respect of the man and the power he wielded, but strangely enough no fear, despite the simple fact that she survived only because of his goodwill. Now however, she was terrified. Strapped in a flimsy shell of durasteel composite, protected by a thin sheet of armor and shield barely enough to survive a high-speed re-entry, hurling through the atmosphere as a shell sent down range. Fear clawed at Arya's mind, cold sticky fingers gripping her very soul. Despite the high temperature caused by the re-entry and the environmental controls of her armor, she felt chill spreading from the frozen pit that was her stomach. Arya shuddered and gritted her teeth. She was better than this. Arya snarled. She loathed her fear. It was a weakness, making her vulnerable. It was unacceptable. That thought was promptly thrown out of her head, when her pod jumped and shook. Arya squeaked, dimly remembering that it was all going according to plan. The drop pod was supposed to enter a wild and erratic flying pattern, making it harder to hit. It didn't help her. At all. Arya closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life she started praying. First to the Force and then to anyone, anything that was listening. No one was listening. Her ride started shaking even harder, as if it was already coming apart. Alarm blared and sudden wave of acceleration slammed into the young Sith. Arya had time for one last shriek, before the pod peeled off around her, letting her free fall for the last kilometer or so. Her HUD lit up with warning signs, marking targets of opportunity and active sensor envelopes. Kriv, Arya shouted just as the gravity re-established its hold over her. Finally her training kicked in, moment after a rail round buzzed near her head. She slammed the controls of the repulsor pack on her back and darted at the ground, hoping to get below the engagement envelopes of the myriad of AA emplacements pinging her. Moments later the anti-gravity pod whined in protest as she returned it to default setting, and it tried to prevent her from slamming in the roof of nearby building. It was a somewhat successful maneuver, because Arya didn't become a stain on the roof. Instead she landed hard, the mechanized joints of her armor protesting as they absorbed the hit. Her HUD flashed with yellow warnings, showing marginal damage to her knee and ankle armor joints. Arya smiled. While her armor was damaged, her body was not. More importantly, she was back on a firm, solid ground. Roof. Whatever. She wasn't falling down from orbit anymore, and that was the important thing. The Sith in training retrieved her carbine from its magnetic hook on her back, discarded the spent repulsor pod and looked around, using both the Force and her armor's built-in sensors to get her bearing. She was about a click from the control center of the shield generator complex, which was the primary target. Shock troopers and pieces of pods were raining around her, further confusing the defenders. Arya braced herself. She had wasted entirely too much time on that roof. It was time to join the action. She took a deep breath, trying to calm down a bit her heart, which was pounding like a jackhammer in her chest. It didn't help. Damn. And we Sith were supposed to be fearless, she muttered. Arya gulped, steeled herself and sprinted toward the edge of the roof. Ashe equals. Planetary shield generator complex. Geonosis. Wahoo, Boyle exclaimed as he slammed into a confused B-1 droid, instantly turning it into a pile of scrap. Waxer landed about 30 meters to the west and wasted no time in retrieving his IR and opening fire at a nearby squad of SB droids. He shot the Nears, which was facing him, and then pumped a grenade in the midst of the others. The following explosion threw mechanic limbs and heads in all directions. Profit, that was awesome, Boyle shouted at his brother, who was dashing his way. A woman shrieked nearby. The clone whirled that way, his blaster at the ready. His grin grew wider when he saw the general's apprentice jumping from the roof of the building to his left. She opened fire from midair, suppressing a pair of command droids which were sneaking at him. Her wild bursts nailed one, which made for an awesome video. The other machine ducked behind a nearby cargo hauler. While the droid found temporarily reprieve from the crazy lass, it made a perfect target for Boyle, who didn't waste the opportunity and blew up the clanker. "Ma'am, troopers Waxer and Boyle reporting. What are your orders?" Arya stared at them for a few seconds before shaking her head and pointing at the biggest building on their right. "We are taking the control center." "Just the three of us?" Waxer asked, a hint of incredulity creeping in his usually professional voice. "Awesome. Boyle grinned. "Do I look suicidal?" she asked, sounding affronted. "They're coming with us," she waved behind the pair. "The more the merrier." Boyle shrugged. His HUD was showing the better part of a company of helldivers converging on their position. "Griff. My HUD's busted," Waxer grumbled after glancing behind them. "Just shoot any clanker or overgrown insect you see," he quipped at his brother. "Enough chit-chat. We are going in," Arya ordered and sprinted towards the command center. The two clones glanced at each other, shrugged and ran after her. =RK=, Republic Cruiser Negotiator 2. Low orbit over Geonosis. Obi-Wan stared at Cody's smug-looking helmet, then at the heavy blaster in the commander's outstretched hand. "You are never going to drop it, are you?" Kenobi moaned, resignation written all over his face. "And risk that you slide back to your old ways?" The clone shook his head sagely. "Not a chance, sir. Now grab the criffing blaster and that rocket launcher." "Vale put you up to this, didn't he?" "The general might have given us a suggestion or two." Obi-Wan was positive that Cody was beaming under his helmet. "Did he now?" the Jedi asked. "Yep. No charging the enemy to get into melee range for us. Next time you decided that doing so is a great idea, we'll just let you go on your own and provide moral support while staying back in cover." So he did read that, among others. "It might please you to know that he had some enlightening things to say to us, because we chose to charge right after you." "I have no doubt about that," Kenobi muttered. "So, let's make sure. No suicidal charges, attacking well-defended position with light weaponry." Cody started checking out items from a mental list. Obi-Wan groaned. He could swear that the nearby clones were snickering at his predicament. "We'll be in position in 3. All units, board your transports and strap up." The voice of the cruiser's captain blasted from hidden speakers. "You heard the skipper," Cody roared. "Mount up, on the double." The commander returned his attention to Kenobi. "Good luck, General." The clone handed him the heavy blaster and headed towards his own transport. Kenobi shook his head, a small smile creeping on his face. At least Cody and the rest of his troopers were warming up a bit towards him after the disaster that was Ryloth. When he thought about it, his face became a granite mask. That battle had been an utter mess and he had been chewed up about it by both Vale and Valentra. Hell, right now it was a part of the officer training course as a textbook case on what not to bloody do. Obi-Wan jumped in the LART that would be carrying him down, placed his blaster on the weapon rack and unhooked his helmet from his belt where it had been hanging, before placing it in place and sealing it. At Ryloth he had acted as he has been trained, as a peacekeeper. And it had gotten a lot of people killed, including the villagers who he had hoped to save by not engaging the enemy with heavy weaponry in their vicinity. That had backfired in spectacular fashion, though not as bad as with Skywalker's unit. Once that debacle had been over, after he had been debriefed on the operation by guard brass and intelligence officers, something that was now a SOP after any major operation, minor too if it was practical, all his mistakes had been pointed out to him in painstaking detail. Then he had been handed some light reading, books on military tactics and strategy. To top it all, he and the Jedi officers on Coruscant who weren't expected to be immediately shipped out to the front were sent to mandatory short courses of command training as Valentra had dubbed it. Most of it had been useful stuff, downright vital even. Things that the Jedi should have been taught before being handed command and sent straight in battle. Frankly, in hindsight he had to agree with Vale. Considering some of his command decision, it was a miracle that Cody or one of the other clones hadn't fragged him. Kenobi was returned to the present, when the two squads that were supposed to act as his bodyguards piled in and started strapping in. He briefly glanced at each one of them. They and their brothers would live or die based on how good a job he did as a general. Obi-Wan gulped. For this operation all ground forces that were nominally under his command were present. He had the fate of more than 100,000 men in his hands. It should have been just as every other time a Jedi had a job to do. He should be viewing them with a dispassionate detachment, not allowing any sentiment he might be feeling to color his better judgment. That would have been the case if Ryloth never happened. His friendship with Cody and few of the other clones under his command wouldn't have mattered. Or the way he had almost lost it during that ill-thought battle. Now however, Obi-Wan simply couldn't force himself to view his men as simply assets that needed to be spent to achieve victory. the way a proper Jedi was supposed to. "We are deploying in 20. Clear the hangars," the captain ordered. Moment later alarms came to life and a calm female voice started a countdown. Obi-Wan closed his eyes and called the Force to his aid. Her cool embrace calmed him down, yet provided no answers. The countdown came to 0 and the Larch shot out of the hangar, joining thousands of others, which were about to make planetfall. Below them, heavily shielded acclimators were already entering the atmosphere, preparing to provide close air support before disgorging their own gunships and transports closer to their targets. With the planetary shield up, such an attempt would have been a suicide, but now, with the fleet busy delivering orbital strikes, most of the first assault wave would make it down, and the real bloodbath would begin. Kenobi opened his eyes and stared at the holotank in the center of his LART, which was showing the tactical situation. Despite the overwhelming surprise and the saturation orbital strikes, transports were winking out of existence, taken out by ground emplacements that were silenced seconds later. Obi-Wan's eyes narrowed. His men were already dying and he couldn't do anything to help them. Vale's words echoed in his head. "Obi-Wan, one day you will have to choose between being one of this era's good little Jedi and a general. From what I've seen, more often than not, those positions don't mesh well together. And become a Sith instead? Well, if you want I probably can find time for one more apprentice, but we both know that this isn't what I mean. I've given a look or two to the ancient holocrons. They do paint quite a different picture of the Jedi. Especially those who weren't exclusively trained on Coruscant." Kenobi shook his head. He knew what Vale has been doing. Not that the man even tried to hide it during their conversations. He had planted seeds of doubt in Obi-Wan's heart and left him to make his own mind. Dealing with someone who just tried to turn him against the Order or the Republic would have been easy, simple even. This, however, was something different. How do you fight the truth staring you in the face? Then they hit the atmosphere and the ride became rather bumpy. =RK=. Chancellor's office. Senate building. Coruscant. Palpatine sat behind the desk in his brand new office. While it was a rather spacious room, even bigger than his old one, his new little kingdom was in the depths of the building, behind more than a dozen checkpoints. Now there was a whole legion in the Senate and around it as a matter of course. More concerning were the myriad of intelligence agents crawling all over the place. Even one such as him simply couldn't mess with all of their heads without no one noticing. Especially when there was a rotating squad of Jedi on the premises. It was all Vale's fault. That criffing upstart had suggested the Senate security overhaul, presenting multiple options. And the current one was the best for Sidious. The rest made him all but prisoner despite all the power he wielded. The worst was that he simply couldn't worm his way out of accepting. After all, those suggestions had made his life as the Chancellor not only safer but easier too. As Sidious, however, the new security measures had significantly curtailed his freedoms as the shadow figure behind the Confederacy. The worst thing was that in practical terms, it didn't meant all that much. Not with the mess that was the Sith leadership right now. Dooku was still on his hunt, trying to find out who exactly was backing the mysterious faction that had been messing up his plans lately. The only bright news on the horizon was that no matter what Vale did, Geonosis was going to be a bloodbath, which was going to inevitably damp his popularity with the Senate and the public at large. Unfortunately, simply ordering him killed or arrested on trumped-up charges wasn't going to hold up on a smell test anytime soon, not with Gar loving the man and likely to rise up a stink if something direct was done through official channels, which left more subtle ways of dealing with Vale. Well, there was always assassinating the man, however it was unlikely that it would work, after all he was rather powerful in the dark side. That still left using bounty hunters as additional distraction. Yeah. That would be best, combined with keeping Vale away from important pieces of his plan. Perhaps send him to Mandalore next. The general appeared to be rather fond of that mercenary he had met on Ryloth. She and the Death Watch would prove a nice distraction, while the Sith re-established their place in the Sith command structure. Besides, it wasn't as if Vale's disruptions were all for the worse. The self-proclaimed Sith was doing a splendid job of discrediting the Jedi. Not to mention that Vale was concentrating most of their attention on himself. On the other hand, all that would be a moot point if he could get Vale as his new apprentice. Perhaps him and Anakin both. That left the war itself. The conflict should have been a grand deception more than anything else. Instead now it was fast escalating into a full-scale war, one which was resisting anyone's attempts at controlling it. The original plan of ending it and simply eliminating the Sith leaderships while they awaited a reward, the fools, wasn't going to work. Because now the Republic's public and Senate wanted their heads mounted on pikes for everyone to see. While he personally found all that hatred delicious and empowering, it presented a problem. Now the Confederacy was starting to play for keeps, and the only reason they haven't won yet was his machinations, leading them to spend ships and troops by striking secondary targets. Oh, Vale's victory at Ryloth and probable success at Geonosis would go a long way in balancing the scales, but it would be a close-run thing. So much so that he had to be very careful when doing anything that might affect the Republic's war machine. At this stage a fast Sith victory wasn't in his best interest. It wouldn't be until he and Dooku were able to re-establish themselves as the undisputed leaders of the Confederacy. Some blackmail, assassinations and honeyed words would go a long way to achieving that goal. However, it would take some time. Of course, ideally, the war would go on for years yet, enabling him to finish building the foundations of his empire. Unfortunately, the slaughter of the senators did more harm in that regard. Oh, a significant part of his standing opposition was gone, however a lot of his supporters went with it too. Now he would have to deal with a lot of new faces, which in turn would mean that he would have to rebuild a part of his power base. After all, it simply wouldn't do for the Senate not to elect him as an emperor when the time came.